My phone said 7:02 a.m., but it might as well have been midnight. The world outside sounded like someone had turned a giant dial down. No cars, no dogs, no clatter of delivery trucks. Even the wind had been put on a leash. I sat up, the mattress complaining under my weight, and for a beat I thought the whole house had gone deaf. Emma's bed was cold, Jacob's too. 97 square feet of 2 rooms and nothing stirring. Their blankets were twisted like people had just stepped out for a second and not come back. I moved through the apartment quiet, because quiet felt like something thin and dangerous you shouldn't bruise. My keys were where I'd left them. The kettle on the stove had dried rings inside. The window looked onto the street, and the street looked back as if someone had shuttered the town overnight. I pulled my phone again. No missed calls, no texts. The carrier symbol blinked and then was gone. I tried Emma's mother. Straight to voicemail. Then I called my neighbor, Mrs. Reyes. Her porch light was off. Her car wasn't in the drive. The radio in my car only hissed and blacked out. I stood in the doorway to the hallway for a long time, listening to the apartment breathe. The sound that finally broke the stillness wasn't anything human. It was the refrigerator motor's distant whine and the soft, anxious creak of building that settles after a hard night. It was the sound of being one thing in a place that had once been many. There are 2 ways people react to an absence. You either fill it with hope, someone called, went to the store, sleeping in a friend's house, or you let your mind measure out the emptiness in sharper units. No cars, every porch dark, not a single note tacked to a community board. I tried the hopeful tally, and it ran thin like an old sweater. The practical part of me, the part that put lunches in brown bags and counted the kids' pills on the counter, took over. If everyone else was gone, there were things to do besides curl up and wait for an explanation. I packed a day's worth of food in my backpack, canned beans, water, the thermos of coffee I always carried on the night shifts. I left a note for Emma and Jacob tucked under Emma's pillow, a cardboard scrawl. If you wake and I'm not here, go to the neighbor's house on Pierce and ring the bell. Don't open for strangers. It felt like a small, ridiculous ritual. It felt like the only thing I could do that might still be obeyed. The street was a picture of decisions unmade. Cars parked haphazardly, drivers having simply abandoned plans mid-gesture. A shopping cart lay sideways, hands still gripping imagined handlebars. The postbox was open, mail scattered like a snowdrift in summer. When I walked past the corner cafe, I found the door unlocked and a cup of coffee cooling on the counter. The barista's apron lay in a neat heap, and there was one patron's paper cup on a table with a lipstick ring on it. Someone had gone for good, not in a hurry. That small human detail cut deeper than any empty road. I drove to the store because I always drove to the store when the world tilted. It was reflex, a muscle memory of responsibility. Stop and Go sat on the corner where I could watch 3 streets at once. In daylight, it was a rectangle of glass and fluorescent light. At night, it turned into something else, a thin seam between routine and the awful other. The first thing I noticed from across the street was that the sign was lit only halfway. The S and the T winked and then went out. The lot had a single shopping cart, one headlight reflecting off its metal. No people. The door was unlocked. That is never how you find a store after a holiday. Being open meant someone had been here recently. Inside, the lights hummed with an off tune, fluorescence splitting the air into stripes. The register was ajar. Shelves were askew where someone had shoved past them. The back room door hung slightly open, and a dark smudge trailed from the bathroom to the back exit, like someone had dragged a wet jacket along the floor. There were red drops on the linoleum. Not a painting, not a smear designed to startle. Drops, small and spaced like punctuation, leading to the back exit. My hands went hot and then cold. I stepped around them because small things like that demanded a measured response. Note it, preserve it, record it. I grabbed the manager's folder from behind the register before I felt the first memory, like a hand on my shoulder. I opened the folder in the fluorescent light, and the rules fell into my lap like pages of a prayer book. They were Thomas's handwriting, cramped, careful, the way someone writes to make sure they can read it later. I didn't read the whole thing then. I read the first page and felt my stomach drop into that long hallway of memory, where faces stand in doorways and everything tilts. Rule 1, never work alone. Rule 2, do not drink on shift after midnight. Rule 3. The bathroom is not an extra room. It's part of the watch. Rule 4. If you hear scraping or tapping behind walls, assume someone is trying to find the seam. Rule 5. Keep the lights angled outward and the aisle mirrors clear. I knew these rules the way I knew my children's birthdays. They weren't just rules. They were the language we used to stay in one piece. The words in the folder were underlined like incantations. Thomas had written notes in the margins. If you have to break it, only break what is necessary. Never improvise. I should tell you something here. If you're the sort of person who likes long explanations before you commit to a story, then now is a good time to stretch and make tea. But if you want the slow burn, the thing that creeps up and doesn't let go, stay. This will take a while, and it isn't tidy. I said that out loud to no one, and it sounded absurd. A guttural laugh, half prayer, half a little woman's stubbornness. I tucked the folder under my arm.
The security console by the back had been cleared. The screen was black. I pressed the power button and the monitors woke with a soft hiss. The footage cycled through a day I'm not sure anyone should have seen. There were long pans of empty aisles, a hand restocking cigarettes, a close-up of a name tag that read Sam Wilson. Then the image fuzzed. Memory, when it comes, doesn't come neat. It sweeps. The first long sweep was the night I trained Mark. He had swaggered in like most new hires did, half listening to the way the world worked because the world had taught him it worked a certain way. Mark had been young and full of rhetorical questions. "So what's this about?" he asked, eyes flicking over the security monitors. He had the kind of disbelief that was almost a joke. "It's a job," Thomas had said. Thomas always said things like that, as if the weight of what he knew could be held in a shrug. He wore the manager's cap like a helmet, and he kept a heavy folder under his arm like a Bible. He was the person who had taught me how to fold the rules into my pockets at night, how to talk like someone who knew boundaries were real. "Rules," I said quietly when I saw Mark's face for the first time up close. He laughed and called them superstitions. He'd been the kind of man who said, "You can't be serious," and then turned the radio up to prove it. William arrived on the second week. He was a shape in a hoodie more than a person for a few nights. A tall thing who moved like he was always 3 seconds out of step with everyone else. Not late, but existing on some parallel schedule. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't have to. He poured coffee with slow hands and never asked for sugar. He wore the same bark hoodie every night, and his sleeves had a habit of slipping back to show hands that were too neat for a man who did not sleep. On the third night, the bathroom made its first sound. It started like a rat tapping at a drain. Mark said it was pipes. I told him the pipes don't sound like that. Thomas told us to listen. The rule about bathrooms had never been written to make sense to a skeptic. It was written because once the seam had found a voice, it liked the acoustics of small rooms. "The bathroom's not a room," Thomas said, leaning on the counter and letting us hear him. "It's a doorway. It echoes." Mark shrugged and went in to smoke a cigarette in the alley like a guy making a bet with himself. He came back pale. The cigarette had fallen from his fingers as if someone had taken it just to make a point. For the next week, he kept looking at the ceiling during the graveyard shift like he expected it to rearrange itself. On the night that became the story everyone told in smaller bits over time, the night the ceiling tiles ripped, we were short-staffed, which is always a bad sign when you work places that fill the night with habits. Ashley was new.
She had this quiet competence that you only see in people who have learned fast out of necessity. She tied her hair with one hand and kept a pocket knife folded like a secret. We were all tired. The world was a little worn at the edges. It started small, a scrape in aisle 3, the smell of wet cardboard, a flicker where the fluorescent should have been stable. We said the rules like we were reading from a manual. We turned the lights to the street. We angled mirrors to widen the view. We closed a lot of eyes and kept what we could. The sound came through the ceiling like something scraping the back of a throat. The light in aisle 3 went out and then back on. On the screen, the camera shook, and in the footage I later watched, late at night, fingers trembling, because looking at that footage at any other hour felt like inviting teeth into the daylight. There was a shadow changing at the seam where the ceiling tiles met. The tiles bent like paper. Something pushed. We followed the rules. We backed up. We locked the back room. We made the circle. William stood between us in the seam like he was leading a prayer. His hands moved in small, measured circles. He never spoke long. He hummed, or maybe he was singing under his breath. The thing that pushed through the tiles made sounds like static, like old radios trying to find a station. It didn't look like anything I could have recognized. There was a smear on the ceiling that was still sticky when we later tested it. We never learned what it left when it retreated. We only learned what happened when rules were not kept. Mark decided at some point that rules were people without backbone. He started ignoring them in small ways. He left the break room door unlocked for a laugh. He took a beer after his shift like he was proving something. The night he disappeared, and I say disappeared because the record doesn't have a better word, he went into the bathroom to smoke and didn't come back. We found his name tag on the sink, wrapped around the faucet like someone had had a rough tug. The footage cut at that point. Where the camera should have been was snow, then a smear that looked like someone had taken a hand through a screen. The audio held, a thin thread of high static, and then the feed went black. We reported it. Detective Ryan Bennett came by later with an old badge and circled questions. He took notes. He asked if I'd seen Mark drink, if he'd been depressed. He asked us to consider other possibilities. He typed everything into a file and then he closed the file. The way police close files is a particular kind of grief. They do it gently, like they're tucking away a child's drawing they no longer understand. After that night, the rules felt like teeth. They bit into the night and kept the things outside from spooning through. William was there every shift after that. He seemed to smile less and watch more.
He taught Ashley to sweep the corners in a way that kept light where light should be. He taught me to check the locks twice, not because the locks would keep out anything without a face, but because the habit counted for something, some measure that kept us anchored. When tourist nights came by and bored men with idea in their heads laughed at us, we let them laugh until laughter became prying. There were costs. There were people who left because they couldn't live with the rules. There were nights we sat with coffee and counted the ones who'd left, and the numbers never made sense. The rules were not a charm. They were a protocol. They were the way you made sure there was something to come home to. Now, standing in the store with Thomas's folder under my arm and red drops like breadcrumb marks on the floor, the past crowded the present so tightly I could smell coffee from 2 months ago. I replayed the footage until my eyes burned, pausing, replaying, squinting at a frame where the camera had betrayed us the most. I found Mark's last moments in fragments, his hand at the sink, a flash of hoodie, a smear at the edge of the screen. Then the screen went to static. I read through the folder, slower than I should have. There were lists, diagrams of the light angles, sketches of symbols Thomas annotated as "keep clean, do not trace." He had pages of notes with shorthand about thin spots, places that frayed more easily, corners by old pipes, places where concrete met older foundation, stores that had been here long enough to remember other layouts. He had written, "Stop and go, seam at storage wall, monitor nightly," and circled it. When I looked up, someone had scratched words on the backroom door with a nail or key. "Keep the line." It wasn't fresh. It wasn't old. It sat like a message you hope is a memory. The town kept its secrets in layers. I found a voicemail on the store's landline from someone named Karen Mitchell. It was static, then a woman's voice, breathless. "They're in the walls. Don't." And then a cut. There was a police note in the folder. Officer Bennett wrote a brief on "Missing Mark Carter" and added a line I couldn't let go of. "No forced entry. Strange residue found in bathroom. Lab results inconclusive." I left the folder open on the counter and walked the aisles again. There was a half-peeled sticker on a cereal box with Jacob's favorite cartoon character. The thinness of these domestic details is their cruelty. They make you think of lunches and scraped knees and the very ordinary cruelty of a child waiting for a parent to come home. By noon, I had a plan I hadn't really consented to. I would do the rounds, check the hardware store for tools, visit the police station, try to use what was left of the local radio. But for that, I needed to be sure about one thing, whether the seam here had been breached recently or whether I had stepped into a house of ghosts.
I found the early CTA, the thing you put into stories because you want people to come along, and mouthed it out to the empty aisles like some private comedian. If you like slow-burning, teeth-in-the-dark stories, stay with me through the night. Just one promise. You don't have to leave right now. I meant it for you, whoever you are, and for me. There is a practical aspect to horror. It rewards the steady. I went to the car and brought back rope, a flashlight with 3 settings, and a can of industrial cleaner from the aisle labeled maintenance. The town had been stripped of bodies, but not of errands. I taped the cleaners into a kit like a surgeon prepping a trivial operation. The first time I ever saw William without the hoodie, it was on a break, when he had to fix something small and his hood fell back, and his hair was gray at the temple. I thought he looked older than I'd imagined. He had a soft voice that didn't match the hands. He disliked being observed when he worked. Once, after a bad night, he left a thermos under the counter with a single cup poured and kept warm. No one ever drank from it, but we kept it there like a relic. There were others who had left notes too. Ashley had left a sticky note on the cigarette rack. "If you must leave, do not go south. The tunnels are older there." She wrote that in pen, and the ink had bled a little. I held it like a talisman. The town had 100 small things that told stories. A child's stuffed dinosaur lodged in the crook of a bench, a calendar with January 1 circled in emphatic red. My breath caught on that last detail, because that was the day I had woken up, and the day everything else seemed to stop. The world had been full of reasons for people to be out and about on New Year's. Parties, hungover neighbors, closed stores. But New Year's morning as an absence felt purposeful, as if someone had hit a pause button on every life. I drove to the police station, because you do that when a hole opens in normalcy, and you hope someone else will take on the edges. The station door was closed. The municipal radio at the desk squealed static, and a voice that might have been a machine issuing canned announcements. There were coffee mugs stacked like little monuments to a place that had been busy yesterday. On the whiteboard, someone had written check-in, roll call, and then scratched it out. A post-it under the board had a list of names: Rebecca, Jason, Joseph. Each name had a little dash next to it. I imagined those dashes as tally marks for people who had left. I took a portable radio from the back shelf and set it to the low bands. Static, then something that sounded like a voice trying to find a station. It whispered the way torn paper whispers. Out in the town, a bell tolled twice. I thought for a moment it might be a clock tower, but there wasn't one. The sound felt like a countdown you couldn't admit to hearing.
I walked the streets with the radio flat against my ear and the folder in my jacket. Back at the stop and go, I tried to piece the footage together in my head. The camera angle that mattered most, the one that caught the seam, was the camera that had gone fuzzy. When you work nights, you learn to read fuzz. It's a thing that eats the edges of images, where the world is not straight. I tuned the monitor, pulled frames, and for the first time recognized something I hadn't seen. In that smear of corrupted pixels, there was a darker geometry, like the shadow of an opening. It didn't make sense, not in any physics I owned. It was there, the way a bruise is there, an injury you don't remember taking. There was a smudged note in Thomas's folder that said simply, "Seams respond to attention." He had drawn a small circle with a dot in the center and wrote, "Do not stare." That's the other part that you have to accept when you've spent 3 years keeping light where light should be. Observation matters. Attention is currency. The seam and stop and go had been paid attention to by humans, and the things it hid had answered in kind. When I locked up that afternoon, the word lock felt more fragile than iron. I found fresh footprints in the back paint room. I had not been the last to leave. The prints led to a hatch in the floor that I didn't remember seeing before. It sat like something should have been buried and was not. The hatch's edges had glue residue, as if someone had tried to seal it and given up. The smell around it was faintly metallic and warm, like a mouth you could not quite place. My hands went to the rule list by habit. Never work alone. If you hear tapping, assume the seam is choosing a place to press. Keep the lights angled toward exits. Do not drink after midnight. The rules filled my mouth and tasted of copper and ash. Each one had a story braided through it. Each story had paid and missing names. I set a motion sensor lamp in the back room and trained it on the hatch. If anything moved at night, I wanted it to be visible. I wrote up 3 small entries in a log like Thomas had taught me: time, observation, action taken, and shoved the pages into the folder where they would be read by no one unless fate chose to make it so. The sun leaned toward evening, and the store's fluorescent lights began to hum like a caged insect. Outside, the town was a tableau. I took the kids' interest badges, a little paper Emma had made that said, "Mommy's the bravest," with a crooked heart, and tucked them into my jacket pocket. It was ridiculous, and it was necessary. I carried the badges like a promise to myself that I would come back for them, whatever that impermeable thing out there demanded. That night, I slept in the back office, with a bead of light from the hall marking the floor. The motion lamp was set to high. The radio sat between us and the seam. I thought about calling Emma's camp, Jacob's friend's dad, anyone. All my numbers were dead.
I tried the file number for Detective Bennett, and the line went to a canned voice asking me to hold. The canned voice was a small thing to comfort me, and then it too fell into the silence. Sometime after 2 a.m, the motion lamp tripped. It wasn't the lamp's steady glow that stirred me. It was a sound like something sliding gently against wet cardboard, the kind of noise a roof makes under the weight of something that doesn't belong there. I reached for the flashlight, and the rules came into my head like prayers. Rule 1. Never work alone. I had broken that rule. I had no one else here. Rule 3. Bathroom is part of the watch. The scrubbing sound came from below, from the hatch, like someone was rubbing the other side of the tone that kept us together. Rule 4. If you hear tapping behind walls, assume seam. My skin felt like paper. I left the back office with the flashlight beam shaking. The motion sensor had tripped, and its light painted shapes on boxes. The hatch lay in the shadow like a mouth. The sound had stopped. On the hatch there was a symbol drawn in what looked like an oily marker. Someone had taken the care to make it strange. A circle with a slash that curved back. Thomas had sketches like it in his folder. He had written, "Do not respond. Keep light between you and seam." I kept the light steady. I didn't knuckle at the hatch. I called out in a voice Henry's church lady would have recognized as a prayer for the missing. "If anyone's there, this is Sam. We are watching. We will not open." For a long time, nothing answered. Then from below came a soft metallic sound, like fingers running along a rim. It stopped, measured, then started again, gentle, testing. The motion sensor ticked, and the radio muffled into static for 1 second, and then came back. I felt my heart thickened with the taste of battery acid. I didn't open the hatch. There is a sequence to these things, and I was the kind of person who followed procedures, because tangles get fatal fast. I went for the camera with gloves on. I set the camera to look down at the hatch from the top of the storage rafter. From this angle, the world looked like a map of small decisions. The camera's red light blinked, and I watched the hatch like someone watching an animal in a trap. The sound returned, a faint scratching, then a whisper low enough to make the floor hum. The camera picked up nothing for a stretch where you wanted clarity. In the last frame before the feed glitch, something moved under the hatch. It was a shift, a geometry that was not natural. Then the frame washed out into white. I turned the camera off with my hands shaking and sat on the floor against the shelving like I was waiting for a train late at night. I folded the rules in my hand like a talisman and whispered the words I half made up to myself to keep the cold from going bone deep. Follow the rules keep us whole. Keep the light out, keep the scene pinned.
I don't know which of those formulations is the rule Thomas wanted us to say, but I said them anyway. They are all versions of the same thing. You survive by paying attention to the boundaries, and when a boundary frays, you do not become inventive. You do not act on impulse. You maintain the circle. The hatch thumped once then, which is not the sound of something mechanical failing, but of something deciding to press at your patience. The motion lamp flashed. In the streak of light, a boot print appeared on the dust beside the hatch, like someone had shifted their weight and stepped out of the dark, then back in. The boot print wasn't mine. I thought of Emma and Jacob lying in bed somewhere, the thin play of a child's breath. I thought of Mark's name tag wrapped around a faucet, of Ashley with her pocket knife. I thought of William pouring coffee, and of Thomas's handwriting, small and precise, and of Detective Bennett, who had the sort of tired eyes that meant he had catalogued many kinds of missing. I could have closed up, left the town and the hatch and the smudged footprints. I could have driven east until I found a highway with more lights. But the rule that nested inside me, the one not on paper, was this: some people keep watch. Sometimes they are chosen by the world. Sometimes they choose the world back. My children needed someone to come home.
On the monitor, a shadow receded from the ladder, and something placed something small and round at the first rung. It might have been a stone. It might have been a coin. It might have been a small eye. The footage stuttered, and the image dissolved into a smear. I took a breath I couldn't afford. The decision hung there. I could haul myself down into that seam with a rope and look at whatever had been using the ladder. I could call someone and try to get reinforcements. Or I could close the hatch and follow the rules that said, if you must choose, choose to contain. My hands found the pocket where Emma's paper badge was folded. I thought about how people teach their children rhymes to ward off bad dreams. If you hear a scratch, tell it no and turn the light on, I told Emma once, not joking. That night, the rhyme felt like an order. I sealed the hatch, but left the motion lamp high and the camera capturing the ladder. I wrote in the log, 0317, movement under hatch. Follow up, do not engage alone. I wrote it like someone leaving a map for their future self. I taped the log into Thomas's folder and locked the store with an extra turn of the key. As I drove home, the street signs cut the sky into rectangles. Each house had its curtains drawn like sleep masks. The town had an empty look that made me want to keep driving until the map forgot where I lived. Instead, I turned on the radio, and the tiny static voice came through with a clipped announcement I half heard as instructions and half heard as prophecy. If you are watching, hold the light. Do not answer when it calls. At the apartment, I made a ritual of the small things. Extra locks on the door, the kettle on the stove clinking like a metronome, the children's clothes arranged in a line as if expecting a parade. I wrote a note and taped it to the inside of my jacket. If I don't come back before tomorrow morning, find William at Stop and Go. William was a person of immediate contradictions. He protected without promise. He kept his hoodie up like he had a secret identity, and then he'd talk about his hometown like a man who had loved something long enough to make it stranger. He'd always been good in a crisis, not heroic in the way people imagine in movies, but efficient and cold in ways that needed to be. I wasn't sure if I wanted to find him because he's a guardian, or because he is the thing we rely on when the world above ground is slippery. Sleep that night was a thin wash of napkin. I woke several times and checked the kids. At 6:02 a.m., I went back to the store because the camera's last feed hadn't been overwritten, and something in me needed to see the ladder again. The hatch was closed when I arrived. The motion lamp was set on a lower sensitivity. The camera feed had a single new clip recorded, 0351, a shadow leaving the ladder, angle and clear. The folder had a new scrap tucked inside, a note in handwriting I didn't immediately recognize. Left to find them, do not follow.
The signature was a single initial I couldn't place. I stayed by the counter and watched the town from the windows like a person who reads weather in the way people used to. No cars moved. A pair of pigeons pecked at the curb. The cup of coffee was gone from the counter where I'd left it the day before. The footprints by the hatch had been partially wiped, as if someone had tried to erase presence. That's when the first shriek cut from somewhere near the pharmacy. Low, animal, human, and then gone. And the thinness of the town felt more like a theater stage after the audience had left. I imagined my children waking up to a house where everyone else had vanished. I imagined trying to tell them you were brave because you had to be. I slid Thomas's folder closed and carried it to the back room, where I set it on the supply shelf. The store felt like it had the right of way, and I had to obey. The rules were a liturgy. The liturgy required an offering. The offering was vigilance. When I left that afternoon, there was a small rectangle of sunlight painted across the parking lot. It made the dust glow like a small diorama of abandoned days. I locked the door and put the key in my pocket. The town looked back like someone withholding a secret. I drove home with the radio on low and the motion lamp footage on a battery bank in the passenger seat, like evidence from a case file. At home, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number with a single line. Do not go south. No signature, no return number. Old instincts say ignore, but rules are made of small signals. The clandestine note sat in the phone like a stone. I stared at the screen until the message blurred. I tried to sleep again, but the hatch's footprint and the whispering ladder refused to leave me. In dreams, I found Mark's name tag on my pillow and William pouring coffee across an empty counter. The town outside kept replicating itself like an echo. I woke with the feel of being watched and with a plan that felt both desperate and reasonable. I would go back to the store at first light, and I would attempt to patch the seam temporarily. I knew down in a place where fear and stubbornness touch that you cannot permanently mend such a thing alone, but you can buy time. Time is what guardians sell at a cost they hope someone else will repay. I packed the camera, the rope, Thomas's folder, and Emma's badge. I kissed my kids like a benediction. I didn't say goodbye because I didn't want the word to be something that could be placed into the ledger of final things. I said instead, I will come back. I tried to make my voice steady and the promise fold like a rule, simple, repeatable, enforceable. On the way out, a neighbor's fridge hummed on a porch where the owner had once placed it during a roof. It was plugged into the day like a living thing. On the screen of my dashboard, the route to Stop and Go mapped itself like a dotted line.
Somewhere along the road, a crow lifted from a fence and flew westward. I will tell you this, by the time I reached the store, the sun had slant, and the town had that thin magic of late afternoon that makes everything a little too visible. The back room smelled of detergent and something older. The hatch had been opened. The rope lay coiled on the floor like a looped question. My hands clenched the handle of Thomas's folder. There were footprints leading away from the store toward the south, toward the part of town the note had warned me about. They were small, feminine prints, and then larger prints, and then nothing. The prints had been made by boots with glue residue on the heel.
I stood in the doorway and the rules fell through my mouth like pieces of a rosary. Never work alone. Keep lights out from seams. Don't be curious where curiosity can be paid in names. Keep the circle. The air felt thin, as if the seam had switched from hiding to listening. I stepped toward the back room and the floor felt like a stage dropping away beneath me. The camera battery read low. The radio sputtered. The motion lamp blinked. In the dimness, the back room door quivered, as if something had brushed it from the wrong side. I drew my breath, tightened the rope at my waist, and reached for the hotchkey. If I had to place the moment I crossed from being a woman who had once kept a regular night job into being someone who would hold a town's seam in a life stripped of ordinary company, it would be this: my hand on the key, the rules on my tongue, the sound of distant bells, and the knowledge that somewhere in the town, in a house with curtains drawn, my children slept unaware that the world had emptied itself like a glass tipped over. I unlocked the hatch. The air that came up smelled like iron and rain in an old cellar. The ladder went down into a darkness that was not just absence but presence, a valet holding open a jacket for something that might come through. I clipped the camera to the rope. The light from above cut into the shaft in a narrow slice. I tested the ladder with my foot. It held. I wrapped the rope's other end around a steel beam and took one step, then another, then down into the seam that had been waiting for feet. The sound closed behind me like a door. The rules hummed like a chorus in my head. At the bottom was a corridor that tapered away, not an actual tunnel constructed by men, but a splitting of geometry that felt older than brick. The walls were rippled as if something had once pressed them like fabric. Far ahead, something flickered like a candle you couldn't use. The motion sensor up above dimmed and then went bright and then dim again. I fumbled the camera to catch movement. A whisper came from the bend, not a sound so much as a question formed of breath and old metal. It slid along the corrugated wall like someone worried a seam with a fingernail to see if it would part.
The beam from my camera trembled and threw the shadow long. I tried to swallow the sudden animal recognition that whatever made that noise knew the rules by heart in a language I hadn't agreed to learn. My boots were soft on the ribbed ladder. The rope at my waist hummed against the metal as if strung with its own impatience. The corridor narrowed into a place that wanted to be a tunnel and kept failing at it. Angles that shouldn't meet did, and where concrete should have ended, something like folded shadow swallowed the line. The smell down here was not one thing. It existed in layers. Old plaster, wet insulation, the faint copper of something that had been cut and never cauterized. I moved like I had always moved on graveyard shifts, deliberate, as if speed could be traded for fewer mistakes. The camera at my shoulder made the light into a small, obedient thing. Where the corridor bent, the whisper came again. Not louder, just closer, as if the thing that made it had leaned in to make sure I was listening. "Rules," I said. I heard my own voice and the absurdity of needing to mouth the word into a place that might respond like a pet. Rule 1, never work alone. Rule 2, do not drink on shift after midnight. Rule 3, the bathroom is not an extra room, it's part of the watch. Rule 4, if you hear scraping or tapping behind walls, assume someone is trying to find the seam. Rule 5, keep the lights angled outward and the aisle mirrors clear. There is a kind of comfort in the mechanical recitation of things that have saved you before. The rules had kept us in the shape of people for as long as I could remember. They kept boundaries in place with the stubbornness of habit. I moved forward because if you stand in a seam and refuse to look, you still give it the attention it needs to widen. The bend released me into a widened niche where someone, a hand, a thing with hands, a pattern of movement, had left things. A child's shoe sat sideways on a concrete lip, its laces chewed off. A strip of fabric dangled like a pennant. There were scribbles drawn into the dust on the wall, an O with a dot and 2 little ticks, the same symbol from Thomas's folder I had been told to never trace. The camera picked it up, and my stomach dove into that low place where dread and recognition meet. I knelt and touched the shoe. It was warm, not by much, but warm enough to mean recent. I couldn't tell if someone had left it as a clue or if something had dropped it on purpose. My hand came away with dust on my palm and a thin smear of oil. I fought desperately of Emma and Jacob and kept my fingers closed around any scrap of hope like a talisman. A memory hit then. William leaning over a coffee cup, his hood pulled just low enough to make a shadow fit his mouth.
He had taught me once the exact way to hold the edge of a light so it didn't throw a spear of brightness and attract something that liked points.
"Light out, not in," he'd said, tapping the brim of the cup. It was a small dictum, but it held weight. He didn't explain. He never explained anything. He corrected and moved on. That was how he kept things from coming apart. Small corrections, a steady hand. The niche had been used. There were notations scratched into a metal plate, little tally marks, and a strip of aluminum shaped into a kind of amulet with the store's price tag punched through. Someone had left a voice recorder there, and it sat like a sleeping insect. I picked it up and thumbed the play. The audio was thin and then broke into a woman's voice. "Ashley, if you're—" There was a hiccup. Static. Then more. "We're not holding on." Lights went, then the ceiling moved like breathing. William said, a rough inhalation. "Do not let it have the mirrors. If you open the back, keep the line. Do not. The playback collapsed into a high keening and then silence. My knees hit the concrete and I felt the world tilt into a remembering I hadn't wanted but had known was there. Ashley's voice, the urgency, the fragment of order, these were shards from the nights they had trained me on. It was like finding an old photograph where the faces are cut out and the edges still smell like someone else's cologne. I cued Thomas's folder with gloved fingers. There were pages I'd never seen, tucked between diagrams, a list titled Containment First Line, and below it a set of handwriting in Thomas's cramped script that matched the way his lists always turned the world into manageable pieces. Containment First Line. 1. Keep light along the perimeter, low and constant. 2. Do not allow mirror space to reflect inward. 3. Use motion as proof, not bait. 4. If an anchor appears, isolate and inscribe. Do not touch with bare hands. 5. If the seam moves, do not follow. Contain. Those 5 items felt like iron placed in my ribcage. Anchor, inscribe, isolate. They had been words in a manual before. Now they were verbs that wanted limbs. I read on. There was an addendum in a different hand, shaky, as if written while the writer had been moving. The addendum said simply, "If you hear the child song on band 5, do not answer. Signal only with 3 beeps." The child song. My throat closed. The air in the seam tasted suddenly like pennies. I found a splinter of mirror, warped, the size of a phone screen, and wrapped it in cloth before I replaced it in my pack. The folder suggested mirrors were necessary to maintain angles, to fold sight outward, but warned that reflective surfaces could also be turned into windows the other side used. It gave instructions for mirror frames, for covering edges, for angling, for making light a fence instead of a spear. I moved deeper, and the tunnel turned again into a chamber that smelled like something old and hungry had slept there.
The floor had been cleared into a circle, 3 chairs placed in a triangle, a bucket overturned, and on the bucket a small pile of coins and a child's drawing of the house. The drawing was done in that thick wax crayon little hands use. There was a crude stick figure with a heart. Someone had used a nail to pin it to the wall. When I touched the crayon heart, the chamber pulsed. That isn't a clean phrase. Nothing in the seam was clean, but the light in my camera wavered like a fish flinching. I heard the same whisper, only this time it sounded like someone humming a lullaby in a key slightly off from human. The drawing fluttered. A scrap of paper next to the coins had handwriting I recognized, Ashley's, tight and small. "If you find this, stay out of the South. We tried to carry them through the old sewers. It didn't hold. William said the line would snap if we pressed. We couldn't stop them. We made the circle at 0240. Mark was..." The voice trailed off in the writing, like the pen had been pulled away. Mark was... The thought of that unfinished sentence made me want to hit something and not feel guilty about the sound. Instead, I folded the paper and slid it into my pocket. It felt obscene to carry other people's grief as a keepsake, but it was also proof. Proof that we had tried. Proof that some had failed. Proof that the rules had cost Mames. The whisper resolved into something that made the hair along my arms rise. A repetition, soft and precise, like someone counting money. It was a voice not quite human saying a number in a language that echoed with the cadence of my own child's counting. 1, 2, 3. It echoed, and the chamber answered. I backed out the way I'd come because the folder had said to isolate anchors and inscribe, but the anchor was not something you could always hold with ink. The coins, the child's drawing, the tally marks, they were anchors in a different sense, small domestic things twisted into purchase tokens for attention. The seam favored small domestic things the way a parasite favors warm blood. They were bait and proof both.
Above ground, the day was dimming into a kind of honest late light. I had been down under the store for maybe 40 minutes. When I came up, the bell above the backroom door clicked like a small clock. The parking lot had a line of shadows I couldn't place. On the floor by the hatch, someone had left a single white glove, the kind surgical teams use. It lay like a hand that had given up on waving. I took the glove and set it against the ledger in Thomas's folder. Someone had been here, leaving things for us to find. The ledger felt heavier than just paper. Names were a weight. An idea lodged in my mouth like a coin. If the seam fed on domestic things, on children's songs and shoes and lunches, perhaps the way back out had been used as a conduit, not a door. Perhaps Mark had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the seam had opened like a greedy mouth.
I set a perimeter outside with the motion lamps, angling them so their light made a ring around the store's exterior. I locked the doors, but not casually. I used 2 deadbolts and a cable, like someone braiding the limbs of the world together. Then I left one window slightly open, set with a wedge so I could see the street. You leave openings for yourself sometimes because you want to know what will happen, and because you need an exit that doesn't feel like a trap. I sat in the office with the folder on my knees and listened to the town. At dusk, the bell tower, whether it was an actual clock or a metal sign somewhere, chimed once and then stopped as if the world had been interrupted mid-thought. My radio picked up on the low bands a pattern like a Morse. 3 beeps, pause, 3 beeps. The folder's addendum had warned, mark with 3 beeps, do not answer. The pattern matched. My throat closed around a question I didn't want to ask. Who else kept the rules? Who else had survived long enough to leave that pattern? And why Jan 1? The calendar in the store had been looped forward to show the circled midnight in red. 100 mundane calendars don't make a reason. The town was a set of reasons stacked like bricks. Some were old and obvious. Some were rotten and secret. It didn't matter why the day had been chosen. Someone had, deliberately or not, pressed the world into a new shape. Night came, and the motion lamps kept their steady watch like iron teeth. The radio hummed, and I sat with William's thermos under the counter in the box he'd left. It was cool, the lid sealed tight. I made coffee anyway. Ritual, too, has many forms. The act of making a cup in a world trying to unmake itself is a small declaration of continued existence. At 23:40, the motion lamp tripped. The light swung and painted the aisles, and then the sound hit. The sound of the ceiling moving like an animal shifting in its sleep. Everything in my chest went to work. I grabbed the camera, the gloves, and the clipboard with the isolated objects. I moved into the store like I had done so many times before, only this time there was no forgivable human error. This time my choices would be the ledger. In the aisle, the air felt thicker than the rest of the store. The hum of the fluorescents had a tremor. The mirrors had fogged at the edges. The camera picked up a shimmer along the seam where the old wall met the newer paneling. A shape pushed through like something smithing itself from paper and static. It didn't have a face so much as an arrangement of angles that our brain wanted to resolve into features and couldn't. It leaned toward the light, and the light was something it was savoring. I remembered the instruction, do not let it have the mirrors. Not because reflections were pretty, because mirrors gave it angles to pry open. I ripped the cloth from the warped mirror and angled it toward the side of the aisle so that the seam was not allowed to see itself.
It felt like tilting a shield at the exact angle so the sun couldn't pass through. The thing drew back with a sound like a plucked wire. The seam pushed again. It wanted what it had wanted before. Attention, domestic crumbs, a child's note. The coins in the jar jingled on the counter, as if stirred by wind. I moved slowly, and in slow motion I heard that rhythm that had been the rules turning in my head. Keep the light out, I said aloud. Keep the circle. The thing answered by scraping at the tile with that thin, grinding sound. Dust rose like breath. In the video monitor, a frame stuttered, and for half a second an image of Mark's hand appeared where it shouldn't have been, raw, urgent, and then the picture dissolved into white. It was as if the seam spat out pieces of other nights, other people, and used them as bait. I set the tripod and the camera in the central aisle, angled so the seam would be in frame no matter what. The instructions in the folder told me to photograph, to document, not for evidence or to make sense, but because attention is currency, and you spend it carefully. I calibrated the camera on manual and left it to hum and gather the light. Then I started to chant the rules. It is strange to realize the thing that steadies you is a litany. I recited them like a prayer, slow and exact. Never work alone.
Do not drink on shift after midnight. The bathroom is part of the watch. If you hear scraping behind walls, assume seam. Keep the lights angled outward. Do not answer the child's song with voice. Count in threes. It was ridiculous, and it was what we had. Around me, the store held its breath. The seam thinned and thickened like the skin of something breathing. I could feel the hairs on my forearms standing at attention. At the far end of the aisle, a ripple ran along the floor like someone had pulled a sheet across a table. The edge of a tile lifted, and then a hand, not properly a hand, but an offset of shapes that our brain wanted to call fingers, probed at the air. It paused, as if surprised at my insistence on the rules. It recoiled as if my attention was an acid. Then, clear as a bell and cutting through the static, came something new, a child's laugh. It was bright and wrong in the way a recorded thing is when you speed it up. It had no warmth. The laugh pinged the air and then stopped. I pictured Emma's laugh and nearly vomited. "Do not answer," I said. The words were a rope for my throat. I took a breath, and instead of replying, I said the signal. 3 beeps on the radio. Short, short, long. The Cattern Thomas's notes had told me to use if I found other guardians. The sound was a small stone thrown into a dark well. The seam flinched. The camera flashed as if the light itself had stuttered. From the shadows stepped someone moving like they owned a dozen years of waking nights. William.
He came out of the darkness with his hoodie up, but his hands bare and moving. He lit a small, battered lantern and set it on the floor in a circle of light. For a second, the store collected itself around him, as if the rest of the world agreed to take a breath. "If you see it, do not let it see you more than once," he said, voice low, like he was leaning into the underside of a secret. He didn't ask how I was. He never did. He simply put his hand on the cloth covering the mirror and adjusted the angle with a practiced tenderness. We moved in a choreography he'd created over unnamed nights. He checked seals, I watched the camera, Ashley's voice played in my head telling me to count in threes. The seam flexed, reaching with geometry that wanted to rearrange the aisle. We kept the light a fence. We'd learned that a fence could hold longer if you didn't stare at the thing on the other side. "How many?" he asked, without looking at me, not asking a number of entities, but how many of us were left in the circle. "2 now," I said, "me and you." The truth of it landed like a small stone of grief. There had been more once, Thomas, Ashley, Mark. Now the room was a roster of names missing from the head count. William inclined his head, and in the gesture there was an acceptance that had nothing to do with consent and everything to do with duty. He moved toward the seam with the careful step of someone who had been taught not to make noise and yet had chosen to move loud enough to be noticed. He placed his hands on the tile near the seam and started to hum, that same low humming I'd seen on footage, the one that matched the frequency we heard in the seam. The sound vibrated in the concrete and made the light in my camera shake. It had a tuning quality, like a musician coaxing an instrument into harmony. The seam answered with a tremor, and then, astonishing and terrible, it folded inward. We used the time like a currency. While the seam drew back, William slid a strip of metal into the ground, a thin, old rebar with a notch he'd carved with a utility knife. He set it so it bridged the seam, and then with a motion that was half incision, half prayer, he placed the amulet of aluminum I'd found in the niche across the notch. The amulet caught the light and flared bright like a coin in a flame. Thomas's notes called them anchors, and William treated the anchors with a devotion that looked at once utilitarian and superstitious. He didn't speak about the origin of the amulet or what it fed on. There was always a mystery with him, and that anonymity was either cruelty or mercy. The seam pressed at the anchor, and for the length of a breath nothing moved. Then the thing scattered like a loose animal. Tiles that had bowed smoothed out. It was as if we'd told the seam a story it didn't want to hear, and it moved on to find a more willing audience. We didn't celebrate. You never celebrated in that business. You took inventory. You patched what you could. We wrapped the anchor in cloth and sealed it. I logged the time. I wrote in Thomas's ledger with a hand that trembled. 23:56. Anchor isolated. Mirror angled. Seam contained. William signed with a small mark that was almost careless, W, then folded the page over as if tucking it to sleep. I had questions, but questions cost time and exposure. We had the night, and we had a fragile hold. William looked at me as if asking whether I would stay. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't have to. The question was in his eyes. "Where are they?" I asked finally. "Emma, Jacob." For the first time in all the nights I'd known him, William's face shifted into something like pity. He drew in a breath and said, "They were not for the seam the first night.
Sometimes families are moved by other hands. He never used the word taken as if to make it an ownership. He said the words like a cartographer might say, "This is a ravine," and then place a mark on a map where the ravine was simply a thing to avoid. I wanted more. I wanted a phone number for a rescue, a direction arrow, a lighthouse that blinked welcome. He could not give me that. He was a guardian, not a god. He had methods and the margins were small. We sat on overturned milk crates and drank coffee from a thermos that tasted like a memory, while the lamp kept constant watch. The town hummed with a silence that had teeth but was not always hungry. William talked about nothing, and that was the way he passed information, through small, useless facts that disguised directions. "Keep the light on the exits, count in threes, make the radio a metronome," he'd said, listing what sounded like a grocery list until you realized it wasn't. There is a moment in files like these where you understand what the job asks. Guardians keep watch because something else will not. They trade family time for the chance that someone else might sleep in a bed with the lights on. It's not nobility. It's a ledger balanced with great fear. "Do you ever stop?" I asked him. Or maybe I didn't. Maybe it was the silence that answered for both of us. "We take shifts," he replied. "Sometimes the shift takes more than you can give." His voice was small and honest, like the confession of a man in a profession that absolved little. We agreed a plan: regular checks of the border, written logs, a 3-beep pattern if anyone else came by, a beacon we could improvise with radio and lamp. I would be the eyes at dawn. He would keep the night watch tonight, and then leave a thermos under the counter like a relic for me to find. It was the arrangement of two people trying to make a precarious promise. When he left the store in the early hours, it felt like someone had closed a lid. The motion light flicked off when his hood disappeared into the street. I slept for an hour on a chair, the folder in my lap, the rules beneath my palm. Dawn came and I felt like I had been woken from a life that was not my own.
Daylight rarely brings answers. It brings sharper pictures of the things you already know, but soften the fear a little. I walked the town with the day's list in my head. Check South Trail, follow footprints, search for any sign of Emma or Jacob, verify Detective Bennett's notes, visit the old sewers Ashley's note had mentioned. The South Trail held the footprints again. They threaded through alleyways and across parks and stopped at a metal grate over an old storm drain. Someone had pried the grate up and left it like an open eyelid. There were scuffs on the rim, as if someone had been dragged out and then not returned. Under the grate, the air smelled of rot and cold metal. The sewers were not places you entered for pleasure. They were places you entered for procedure. Ashley's note had said they used the sewers to move people because the tunnels predated the seam's predictable preferences. I opened my pack and pulled a flashlight, a spare battery, a coil of rope. The rules never said you couldn't improvise a ladder. They said, don't follow the seam alone. I had ignored the alone before. I didn't this time. I picked up the radio and tapped the 3-beep pattern so whatever watches there might be knew I was moving. No one answered. The radio returned only static, like a mouthful of teeth. My rope had a fray in it, a small nick I'd missed when I bought it from the hardware. I cursed and wrapped a tie around it. The world had a way of showing you how unready you were, and then waiting to see what you do. I crawled into the sewers. There was a rhythm to that world too. The drip, the slimy smear on the wall, the way your light had to be regulated so it didn't draw hunger. I moved slowly and found the passage that Ashley had hinted at, a small niche where people could hide without being noticed. Someone had left signs there, smudges of chalk that formed triangles, a little scrap of fabric like a flag. The niche held human traces, a child's scarf, a thermos dented by use, scribbled notes pinned into the concrete like those we make to remind ourselves of birthdays. Among them I found a list of goods, canned soup, bandages, a small pack of batteries, and an imprint of a child's hand on a paper bag. There was no sign of life beyond these provisions. Whoever had used the shelter had left in a hurry or had been forced out. There was also a note in shaky handwriting on a scrap of paper that read, "Moved them to the West Sub-Basin. If you follow the sewer, do not sing. They answer to songs." The scribe's name was blurred, but the letters looked like Ashley's. West Sub-Basin, a place I did not know. It sounded like a mapping term for someone trying to give directions in a landscape they no longer felt they belonged to. I ran my thumb over the letters and felt the residue of ink like a map I had the obligation to read. Back above ground, the town sagged, as if relieved I'd come up.
The bench near the pharmacy had a message carved into it. We tried. The simpleness of it made me want to cry and laugh in equal measures. Guardians work in small, devastated truths. I called Detective Bennett's number again. It rang, and then, bless him, he answered. He sounded like he had been up, and all-nighter in a job where nights never end. "You found something?" he asked. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded like a man who'd been following a thread and found enough loose ends to knit a sweater of worry. "I have Thomas's ledger," I said, "and footage, and I think Ashley was onto something with the sewers." He breathed a laugh that was more like a bark. "You never did tell me why you work the graveyard, Sam. I should have asked more pointed things." "Do your job," I said, "if you can. Follow the South Trail. If you find anchors, isolate. 3 beeps if you make contact with someone who knows the rules." He made the sound people make when they move the weight of a promise onto their shoulders. "I will. Meet at the station at 9. Bring Thomas's folder." We both knew he couldn't keep a religious watch. He wasn't built for it. But he could read files and move paperwork and, where necessary, sign off on the things the bureaucratic world still allowed. Missing persons, patrol reports, an official note that someone had tried to hold a seam. I hung up and drove the streets like a woman possessed with a to-do list. The town had the look of a place that had been pressed and shaken. The hours blurred. I found small things: an overthrown chair with a child's sock in a bush, a telephone booth with a message scratched in the glass, "Do not stay," a grocery bag with a child's name written on it in marker, Jacob W. The presence of my child's name on anything that wasn't his hand made my throat hollow. That afternoon, Detective Bennett showed up at the store with a box of evidence and coffee. He carried himself as if the world had done him a poor turn and he had to clean up afterwards. His eyes had the tiredness of someone who'd cataloged the disappearance of many things that were not meant to be cataloged. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said, half accusation, half consolation. He was the kind of man who used flat statements like a bandage. "I know the rules," I told him, "and I know how to keep the line." He sat across from me at the counter and opened the evidence box. Inside were photos and notes and a small black legal-sized envelope marked "Withheld." He slid across a series of printed screenshots from the security footage. In the gloom of the images, the seam looked like a smear of ink bleeding through paper. "We ran the lab report on the residue," he said. "Nothing we can put in our books. It's not biological in a way our tests like. It looks like oxidized lubricant," and he shook his head. "We put it in the report, and the report sat at the end of a line." I handed him the 3-beep signal I had recorded, and he listened to it with his eyes half closed. "You make very specific noises," he said, "like someone speaking a language." "Do you believe me?" I asked directly, which is something you don't often do with men like him. You had to make them choose. He looked at the floor for the space of a breath. "I don't know what to believe," he said honestly, "but I know this. People are missing. Your footage shows things that don't fit. Thomas's folder has a ledger. Someone is keeping notes. That matters in my job." We made a plan we both knew might fail, but which had the virtue of not being entirely stupid. He would send a patrol of officers to the South Trail, with night vision and proper backup. He would contact regional units about the West Subbasin. He would put patrols around the stores with the notation, "Keep the lights on." He did not, in his procedural way, call it guarding a seam, because that would make it private and unpaperable. He called it increased watch. The sky went to a kind of deep purple and feathered away. I left with the folder and a sense of temporary progress. Detective Bennett's car followed mine for a while, and then turned off to a route different from mine, as if by habit. I watched him go, and felt an old, almost childish expectation that someone with a badge could fix what a seam could not be convinced to mend. Night fell, and with it the tasks that Guardians call trivial. Check the anchors, rotate the camera, refresh the mirror, write the time. The motions become rituals, because rituals are engineered at the intersection of muscle and fear. They create a shape for days that otherwise will be all edges. At 02:06, the radio picked up a signal, a ragged voice half lost in static. "Help! Children! West!" It echoed and then dropped into a choked silence. I slammed the radio to record and replay until the audio was a shredded tape of breath and a syllable that sounded like Emma. My heart did something animal in my chest. My hands shook as I rewound the recording. "Do not answer the child's song with voice," I reminded myself. But the savings of the rule felt thin next to the sound of a name that might have been my daughter's. William was at the door when I called him. He had a thermos clutched like a religious relic and a bit of ash on his sleeve as if he'd been near a small fire. He didn't ask for details. He knew the look in my face well enough to read a gay's work. "The sewers, West," he said. "We do not go alone again." I looked at him and saw a man who had been asked to be more than human and had answered with a sequence of practicalities. "We won't go alone," I said. "We will take the camera, the mirror, the rope. We'll keep the light out." We drove the service roads to the West Subbasin in a silence that is almost its own language.
I thought of Detective Bennett informing me of patrols and hoped his careful bureaucratic engine had done enough to shift the balance. We found the sewer mouth where Ashley's note suggested, and we found, around it, signs of a hurried crossing, footprints, a child's scarf caught on barbed wire. Someone had been dragged through the field and not back. Entering the sub-basin felt like stepping into a mouth. The light of our headlamps made small islands of day in a river of old green dark. We moved with a planned slowness, checking each angle. The geometry here was different. The walls curved incorrectly, as if the builders had had the idea of a corridor in mind, and the materials insisted on being softer. At a bend, the air thinned and I heard the child's song again, quiet and slow and terrible. It was a tune you could hum in the kitchen and have your child clap their hands for. The effect of it here was something like betrayal. The thing that answered the child's song was not a person. It was a shape that had learned to imitate small domestic sounds to call us, to lure us towards its appetite. It had taken on the textures of shoes and soup and pockets. William slowed. His hand went to a pocket, and he produced a small whistle, something that made 3 beeps and then silence, like the beeping pattern we'd used earlier. He blew it twice. The sound broke the song and turned it into a gap. In that gap we saw, in the corner, hunched and knitting itself out of what could best be described as contradiction, a figure that was maybe the size of a man, but not a man. Tucked under it were 2 small shapes, wrapped and still. My throat constricted as if to choke a sob. The shapes were breathless, but not necessarily lifeless. It was ambiguous, and that ambiguity gnawed at me. Hope pinned with fear. We did not move in a straight line, because the seam made such lines dangerous. William and I approached in a loop, the old ritual of not presenting a single face to something that learned faces. We angled mirrors so that light would not be used to pry the seam open. We set the tripod with the camera trained and let it hum. The creature recoiled at the beeps, and in the recoil one of the small wrapped shapes slid to the ground. It was a child's sock, and in the small welt of light it looked like something made of memory. William moved with a quick, fluid motion that had no excess. He loosed a strip of something metallic and slammed it across the seam like a splint. The creature shrieked like glass and scuttled backward into a fissure, reshaping itself into the slats of the sewer. I ran to the child. I peeled back the wrap with gloved hands and found a small sleeping arm and a face, not Emma's, not Jacob's, a child of maybe 6 who coughed and then startled into waking. Her eyes were hollow with fear and bright with life. I propped her and felt a pulse like furious bird thudding. She had a name tag pinned with a pen. Lucy.
Lucy, I said, because names ground things. She clutched at my sleeve and mouthed something. Mommy. The instant terror of that sound made blood knock at the back of my teeth. It could be the seams playing at longing, or it could be an actual child seeking an actual parent. I had both hope and suspicion braided into the same rope. We carried Lucy out of the sewer and into a sky that was turning gray with the threat of rain. The town felt suddenly like a place with one more story to be told. We found more signs in the sub-basin. Bedding left, a cassette player, a child's shoe neatly placed on a ledge. People had tried to make sanctuary here. Whether they'd left or been forced out, whether they'd been saved elsewhere, it was too early to say. Detective Bennett arrived with 2 patrolmen and an EMT. He took Lucy, ran her through the motions, a quick assessment, the sterile questions. He looked at me like he wanted to pin gratitude to my chest. We both knew gratitude could be a fragile thing when stacks of things remained missing. "Do you want us to comb the sewers?" Bennett asked. "Yes," I said, the answer almost violent in its simplicity. "Do not sing, count in 3s, isolate anything that looks like an anchor." He did as told with a bureaucrat's obedience. Paperwork is sometimes the only weapon a man like him has, and he used it as if it were the leverage the world offered. He left a man to guard the southern trail and asked me to sit and write a statement. I did, stiff fingers copying down what I had seen and what I had done because it was necessary. Statements are little fossil records. That night, back at the store, the town felt like it's had an offering given and not immediately consumed. Lucy was in the emergency vehicle with a blanket and a stuffed animal that had always been her parents' spare. She was, in a small way, proof that some of the seams could be resisted. We made the plan then that would become a ledger of the rest of my days for as long as I could hold it. Rotate guards with the 3-beep signal, maintain a public ledger with Thomas's folder formalized into a flame-proof binder at the police station, post a bulletin for anyone who had knowledge of the anchors or seams to report under the cover of official channels. The bureaucratic camouflage of evidence keeps things tidy for some part of the world. Detective Bennett promised to escalate to regional units. I watched him leave with Lucy in the ambulance and felt like I'd gained and lost in equal measure. The world had a way of handing you proof
and then taking a further name off the board. I left a message taped inside Thomas's folder. If you read this and know how to keep the line, respond with 3 beeps. William signed the interior cover, a small scratch that looked like a tally. Weeks began to fold themselves into that pattern. I kept the store. I kept the lights turned just so.
I taught a handful of new people the rules as Thomas had taught me, the way Thomas had been taught by a ledger of predecessors, and each time a voice left the classroom skeptical, it either left and never came back, or it stayed and adapted to the night. Ashley's notes grew into a codex in the folder, diagrams for mirror angles, lists of materials that seemed to blunt the seam's appetite, and a heartbreaking list titled For Emma and Jacob, with instructions on where to look if family members were separated during a breach. There were successes and failures. Patrols found empty houses that were quiet as museums. They found cars with doors open and single coffee cups cooling on counters. Detective Bennett's files filled with reports, and then with corollaries, and then, somewhere down the line, with the quiet resignation of men documenting something the rest of the city didn't know how to read. He came by on occasion, eyes bright with the intensity of someone who refuses to let files become ashes. He asked questions that were useful. He mailed copies of certain reports to another precinct labeled Review. The word review felt like a soft promise. People came through the doors of the store in small numbers. A man with a child wrapped in blankets who'd walked 40 blocks from a shelter and swore he'd heard music in the sewers. An old woman who spoke of a hooded figure who had once saved her across a frozen river. A teenager who had seen a shadow in the subway and left his baseball glove behind. Each story was a thread, and I, like a poor seamstress, tried to stitch them into meaning. Sometimes the threads matched, sometimes they frayed. And every night I woke with the same sharp knowledge. The rules keep us alive. I said them aloud before my shift, as if to warm my tongue for the work. Never work alone. Do not drink on shift after midnight. Check the bathroom and the hatch. Keep the light outward. Count in 3s. The town, altered and thin, began to gather its own slow system of guardians. A patchwork of people with thermoses, with battered lanterns, and with the stubbornness to count in 3-beat signals began to form. They left messages behind counters and beneath register drawers. Sometimes they were names, sometimes they were grocery lists. Mostly they were notes left like prayers. If you find this, help the Wilsons. I never again woke to a morning without someone noticing. People found ways to keep moving through a world that had been clipped at the edges. We learned to leave for one another. We perfected small operations. A 2-hour sweep at dusk, a daylight recon with a note for what we'd found. We built a ritual of handing over the ledger to someone else at 9 in the morning so I could go home and actually sleep for something resembling a few hours. I went home and kissed Emma and Jacob as if I were tucking them to a room in a lighthouse.
I told them stories that contained no seam, just simple things like, "We're safe now," because children need sentences that close. Whether those sentences were true was a private ledger. I kept my watch, and I kept my promises. On the morning of March 3rd, the town answered with a single thin radio signal, 3 beeps, that came not from my own device but from a block east I didn't recognize. I put down the kettle and listened. The sound repeated. I called back with the same pattern. Someone answered, a woman's voice, small and raw, saying only, "We hold the breach." That is not the same as finding them, not the same as getting everything back, but it is the way of a community formed by common danger. You trade places with another bearer, and you hold something, so someone else can breathe. There were days of victory. There were days of loss. Mark's file never closed in ways that felt decent. The footage of that night remained incomplete and terrible. We found items that may have been his in a different seam, a lighter, a cuff, the battered edge of a jacket. No finality came with it, only the shape of a missing name. We grieved in the forms our jobs allowed, with small rituals of memory, with the ledger that I